Okay. Well, I understand that Mr. Penfold is going to introduce the report.
Eso, exactamente.
Okay.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cindy Arnson, the director of the Latin American program at the Wilson Center. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this important discussion of Venezuela democratization, thoughts on a new path. The report that we are releasing today is the result of an extensive process of discussion and exchange. This took place over several months between US, Venezuelan, and European thought leaders, all of us concerned about Venezuela's multiple and overlapping crises and the lack of progress in breaking a tragic impasse between the Venezuelan opposition and the regime of Nicolás Maduro. The purpose of the Venezuela Working Group that we were all part of is and was to offer fresh and up-to-date analysis about what has impeded democratic political change in Venezuela, and also to explore options for future democratization, economic recovery, and civil harmony. The working group includes experts from multiple disciplines and perspectives on Venezuelan politics, economics, civil society, public policy, and international relations. And it also includes authorities on transitions from authoritarianism in other countries. The report that we released today and that is available on our website was written by Michael Penfold, our first speaker. Michael is a Lowenthal Public Policy Fellow at the Wilson Center and also a professor at the Instituto de Estudios Superiores de Administración, IESA, in Caracas. The report benefits from the discussions of the working group, as well as the comments, extensive in many cases, and suggestions of working group members. The commentators in today's discussion are scholars and renowned political leaders with extensive expertise on issues of democratization. And they include two, President Lagos of Chile, Minister Holguín of Colombia, with direct experience on Venezuela. So it is my pleasure to also introduce President Ricardo Lagos, the former president of Chile, and a courageous architect of Chile's transition to democracy. Maria Ángela Holguín, former foreign minister of Colombia, she played a direct role in the formation of the Lima Group of Nations, seeking a political and diplomatic solution in Venezuela, and also seeking to mitigate the impact of Venezuela's crisis on other countries of the region. And Francis Fukuyama is a professor at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and is the renowned, truly renowned author of seminal books on development and international relations. There is simultaneous translation for today's event. If you go to the bottom of the screen and click on interpretation, you can choose your language, either English or Spanish. And there will also be time after the initial presentations and comments to ask questions of the panelists. So please send a tweet to @LatAmprog, LATAMPROG, and we will get to as many questions as time permits. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Michael, but first I must thank Beatriz Garcia Nice of the Latin American program staff, as well as Oscar Cruz for their support, not only for the working group, but for today's event. Go ahead.
Thank you, Cindy. I want to, first of all, thank the over 20 members of the Venezuelan Working Group at the Wilson Center for the discussions and the debates that allowed this report to be written. And particularly, I want to thank Cindy Arnson and Abe Lowenthal for the intellectual stewardship of working with the group to see it conclude this report. And also thank President Lagos and former Foreign Minister Maria Angela Holguín and Professor Fukuyama for giving us the privilege to be commentators in this presentation. I want to start, first of all, sort of mentioning what was our initial debate about Venezuela and whether political change was at hand or instead the regime had become more consolidated in the country. And that initial debate really had to do with democratization policy in Venezuela and what kind of policy was desirable and what kind of of democratization policy was really feasible. And that discussion, for example, led us very quickly to understand that what in Venezuela is desirable, really, is a democratization process that leads to a rapid transition that restores the rule of law and that addresses corruption and puts an end to human rights violation. And that all be done through democratic, fair and free elections. But as we stand, the possibility of that desirable outcome today seems more removed than perhaps almost 3 years ago when Guaidó was self-sworn into power as interim president. So the discussion really has to move in the case of Venezuela towards what's feasible, given the current constraints that the opposition faces in regard to the very nature of the regime. And what we can say about the nature of the regime, which I'll go into this a little bit further on, is that its own nature will impose on Venezuelans what I think and the group believes is going to be a long road towards democratization, and not the kind of long, short and scenic, heroic route that many believed 3 years ago that Venezuela was going to face. And in general terms, what this means is that Venezuela will probably have to move through different stages, which I think still need to be very, very well defined, but that more or less will follow a process where we believe that the regime might be or might face some incentives not to hand power back, but to promote some kind of political opening. And that political opening, we believe, in that first stage can be achieved through a negotiations process of some sort. And that could lead, if the opposition is able to rebuild its unity and it's able to reorganize itself, particularly in the domestic arena, it can lead to a democratization process given that window of opportunity that might emerge from that negotiation. And finally, if both of those steps are conducted and the opposition is able not only to reunite, but to reconnect with the needs of the population and its capacity to mobilize society in Venezuela, then we could potentially see down the road, in that long road, a full transition in Venezuela, which is going to take more time than many expected, as I said many years ago, 3 years ago. So what are the constraints that the opposition is facing in Venezuela? What is the nature of the authoritarian regime in Venezuela? In many ways, Venezuela has always been at the vanguard of political development in Venezuela, in Latin America. We were among the first countries that were democratic. We achieved a process of transition in 1958 by a swift transition that was a pacted political pact. And we were able to consolidate that democracy throughout almost 40 years. But at the same time, Venezuela has also been at the vanguard globally of what these new authoritarian regimes are and what their nature really is. And that nature, in the case of Venezuela, is related to two pillars. First, the party, which is a hegemonic party. Secondly, the military. And thirdly, the role of the president that in many ways brokers the relationship between the party and the military, providing them more access to rents and to clientele, depending on the kind of international and domestic political context that the regime is facing. It's also a regime that it's embedded in an illicit economy, that is willing to use that economy to bypass international sanctions. It has developed strong repressive capabilities, but at the same time, it's a regime that is able to shift to electoral phases when they perceive that the opposition has lost competitiveness, and is able to shift towards a more authoritarian phase if they perceive that they face an opposition that is ready not only to compete, but actually to win elections. So that nature in many ways, and that capability of shifting gears from one phase to the other, from an authoritarian to a democratic phase, really is built on the strong control over institutions and basically the destruction of the rule of law. In fact, if you look at Venezuela today as a regime, it's more similar to some Middle Eastern countries than even some other countries in Latin America, although obviously Nicaragua is also becoming close to what Venezuela is going through. But given that nature, the real question in Venezuela is, does the regime face any incentives to open up? And is it feasible, given the kind of international pressure and the international isolation that the regime is going through, international pressures, particularly through economic and individual sanctions, and diplomatic isolation by the fact that the regime is not being recognized, particularly by the Western Hemisphere and even Europe. Even though Europe doesn't recognize today the interim government, it does not recognize either Maduro, which is not the case with the United States. And we argue in the report that, in fact, the regime does, unlike what many argue, that this kind of regimes never face any incentives to open up. We believe that given those pressures, the regime does face incentives to produce that. First of all, I think that what we've seen is a regime that is capable of resisting in power, in part because it has its own international coalition. The Chavista regime is very well connected with Turkey, with Russia, with China, with Cuba. And these countries are absolutely essential in helping the regime survive, particularly by bypassing sanctions and also helping the regime financially and providing them with key capabilities to remain in power. At the same time, given those constraints, the regime understands that they can resist in power, but that as of today, with the humanitarian crisis that they're facing, they're not able to govern. So they need some kind of political recognition. They need access to multilateral institutions. They require also that countries within the region and within the Western Hemisphere overall, and even Europe, to recognize that even though they're not legitimizing the regime, that they recognize that they're ruling. So that's a second incentive that the regime is facing, as well as internal pressures, because there are actors, particularly the military, that have helped the regime to survive and to resist, and they're willing to do so in the face of those internal pressures, which they believe, and particularly they believe that they've defeated the US threats to their own position. They also understand that those external threats are not going to go away over time, that there are risks that they need to reduce, and that those risks require some kind of rearrangement of where the political regime is standing off today. There's also issues about transitional justice. The regime is formally now being investigated by the International Court. And that's going to provide also incentives to develop some kind of framework, not only at the domestic level, that can help address some of these issues in a more organized way, as it was done in Colombia during the negotiations with the FARC. And finally, there's changes in the international context, particularly in Latin America, whereby the regime perceives that they are standing today in a better position to promote that opening. And also, Maduro wants to be reelected, perhaps in 2024. And he understands, I think, that he needs to solve that issue in order for internally get the go, particularly by his own party and by the military, to be able to run for re-election, or instead allow the regime to conduct some kind of alternability in power within the hegemonic a party that is currently ruling in Venezuela. So given these constraints, I think it's kind of difficult to believe that you're going to have a rapid transition of the kind of what we thought that was desirable 3 years ago. And instead, what we're perhaps going to face is more an extrication kind of transition or political opening in Venezuela that is going to require more pulling and less pushing in order to align these incentives in the case of Venezuela and its attempt to move towards a democratization process. I want to end basically with the kind of recommendations that we developed throughout this report. As of today, I think it's fair to say that the opposition and the United States and Europe and most countries in Latin America have been moving towards an acceptance that the process of democratization in Venezuela is going to require some previous negotiation. Some hope that that negotiation will lead to a full transition. I think, and we believe in the group, that that's probably a more wishful thinking given the nature of the regime. But we do think that it can lead to that kind of political opening, that if a reorganized opposition and a more mature leadership is able to take advantage of it, it can move towards a full process of democratization. As of today, the Mexico talks are stalled. However, yesterday, the foreign minister of the Chavista regime, along with the foreign minister of Russia, who is a guarantor, one of the guarantors of the talks, announced that they're looking forward to resume talks sometime in the near future. So I think that's a good news, and it's a good news also given the fact that the opposition has remained put in the table of negotiation. It has not decided to leave that table, where it shows a strong commitment in their understanding that this will require a negotiation process. So how can we move forward in Venezuela? I think we need several changes in terms of our strategy. The idea that maximum pressure is gonna bring a transition process and will break down the ruling coalition, I think it's a theory of change that gradually the opposition is leaving behind, although there's still factions within the opposition that believe that that's a feasible option too. But nonetheless requires first a strong engagement by the opposition, in the sense that they're not only talking and negotiating Mexico City, but they're actually rebuilding its own unity in Venezuela. That it's an opposition that understands that at the end, the political change they'll be able to capitalize in the country and not necessarily only abroad, that this requires them to rebuild their own rules to make decisions, but it also requires them to accept that the constraints over the electoral schedule that might emerge with these talks will require a strong political organization and a reconnection with a society at whole. Secondly, the talks need to center more on what I think is the key, or we believe it's the key element of the talks, which is the electoral schedule. The vision of the Chavistas are that elections are going to be held according to what's stated in the Constitution. That is, they're not going to repeat elections. And that means that presidential elections will be in 2024. And even if they lose that presidential election, the opposition will face a National Assembly that no one recognizes, that where they hold a supermajority. And for those elections, that would be in 2025. Instead, the opposition wants to move forward these elections. And in turn, we also have a recall referendum that might be activated in 2022, which I think is very difficult to activate because of the way to recollect firms in Venezuela. And also because it would put the whole debate in a zero-sum game again in the country. But the important thing to understand is that after 2023, Maduro can resign and no presidential elections will need to be held. And in fact, he can appoint his own vice president. So the regime has a fixed schedule, and they also have an optionality of perhaps moving towards some kind of alternation within the hegemonic regime. So the opposition needs to understand this very clearly. And if they're going to negotiate only an electoral schedule without clear electoral and institutional guarantees, I think that discussion is going to be very, very difficult, particularly given the low leverage they hold today. The other important thing is facing the talks. And I think one of the great things about the design that the Norwegians have put forward in Mexico City is that it's more flexible. So we can face the outcome. And that will require that the US signals very clearly what will be lifted in terms of sanctions in each one of those phases. So the second thing that talk needs to address is the facing of the process and what will be lifted in each phase that is that both parties consent. Finally, we need to move towards a civil society that is more engaged in the process. Negotiation processes have been held before in Venezuela. We have 4 of them that have failed. And I believe that they have failed basically because there are no stakeholders in negotiation processes in Venezuela. So we need stakeholders that really care, and where politicians face a high cost of leaving the talks, as Chavismo did, for example, a few weeks ago, and that now is announcing that they might resume sometime in the near future. We need also to address the humanitarian crisis, because Venezuelans support a 56% of Venezuelans support a negotiated solution. And most Venezuelans believe that that's the best way to solve the institutional crisis that Venezuela is facing. But those Venezuelans are very skeptical of the fact that the talks might end in real outcomes for them. And the only way to do that is engaging with the humanitarian crisis. I think it's important for Mexico not only to advance in terms of providing a national program for vaccination, which was approved in the first meeting, but fully addressing the humanitarian crisis, not only in the health sector, but particularly in the educational sector and the electricity sector. So people can see that out of those talks, there are concrete things that are emerging that affect their lives. And that will also increase the stakes for both parties, not to leave the talks and rather move towards some kind of agreement. I'll end also with an issue that I think is essential, given the kind of regime that Venezuela has. The armed forces in Venezuela have been a traditional key actor in any political transition in Venezuela. There has been no democratic transition, neither the one in 1945, neither the one in 1958. And in fact, there has been no regime change of any sort in Venezuela with their participation in some way or the other. And in the case right now, the armed forces has been a key actor to sustain Chavismo. And I believe that's the case because they fear any rapid transition that could put at risk both their legitimate organizational interests, but also their illegitimate interests related basically to their control of both legal and illegal sectors of the economy. So right now, one of the reasons why the transition in Venezuela failed, and today we're facing a more consolidated regime, is because even if there are actors within the ruling coalition, including the military, that would like to see some kind of political change, the kind of offer, the kind of outcome that they're seeing that the opposition might be promoting is one that they perceive they cannot influence, and that might put at risk both of those types of interests. So this is gonna require to understand, first of all, that the armed forces, given the characteristics of the regime, is not gonna be in the first line. They're not gonna break up to do that process, but they might be part of that pulling if the right incentives are correctly designed. And this, again, is gonna require some strong signaling, both from the democratic opposition and also from the international community. So I'll leave it there, Cindy, with what were sort of the main broad recommendations that emerged from our working group and that are reflected in the report.
Michael, thanks so much for that overview. Again, the report is on our website. There's but you can dig into the details if you'd like. Please, Maria Angela Holguín.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Thank you for the Wilson Center for the invitation. I am going to switch to Spanish if you don't mind. Quiero felicitar a Michael Penfold por el documento. Realmente es un excelente documento, Michael, y toda la gente que trabajó en él. Muchas felicitaciones, porque creo que es como la primera vez que se ve algo en muy corto, en muy pocas páginas, pero tan conciso y tan preciso de la situación de Venezuela. Yo diría básicamente lo siguiente. Hay que aprender de los errores. Vamos a mirar, yo no voy a referirme al pasado. Creo que Michael hizo un buen resumen en el documento, sobre todo está un buen resumen. Hay que aprender de los errores del pasado y hay varias lecciones. Primero, hay que convencerse que la salida hacia una democratización de Venezuela es a través del diálogo y la negociación. Esa es la salida, no hay plan B y no hay cartas inmediatistas. Yo creo que mientras la oposición crea que por algún lado puede haber una solución distinta, se sigue perdiendo tiempo. Segundo, que la comunidad internacional apoya, pero no resuelve la situación. Durante muchos años, la oposición también ha gastado demasiado tiempo en que sea la comunidad internacional y los países los que resuelvan una situación que no la va a resolver, se resuelve sino dentro de venezolanos. Y Michael lo decía muy bien, yo creo que varias de las cosas y tal vez de lo más complejo es cómo se va a reorganizar la oposición, cómo se va a unir la oposición, cómo se logra consolidar una estrategia de mediano y largo plazo que independientemente de que tengan visiones distintas, tienen que concentrarse en que el camino hacia la democratización de Venezuela, como dice Michael también, es largo, no es de un día para otro y requiere que estén unidos absolutamente todos los liderazgos de la oposición. Yo creo que ahí la renovación de un liderazgo es importante. Yo creo que tienen que salir figuras de los mismos partidos, pero también personas que se han quedado a vivir en Venezuela y que les ha tocado vivir pues la dureza de ese régimen. Yo diría que las elecciones son importantes, las elecciones deben ser un objetivo sin lugar a dudas, pero aquí tiene que haber algo mucho más. Y yo lo comparo un poco con el proceso de paz en Colombia. Nosotros estábamos buscando el fin de la guerra, pero también ese fin de la guerra necesita unos cambios estructurales y unos cambios para que el país, en este caso Colombia, fuera distinto. Y yo creo que en el caso de Venezuela, así como las elecciones transparentes, sin que haya personas que estén inhabilitadas y que sean lo más observadas posibles, necesitan también que haya unos cambios constitucionales en Venezuela, que creo que la negociación es importante y puede llegar a darse. Y Michael también lo menciona en su escrito. Creo que los militares, así como en Venezuela es muy particular, que son como parte de las soluciones y parte fundamental de cualquier cambio o transición, también hay que lograr que vuelvan a su rol constitucional, a su rol de seguridad y defensa. Nada más difícil y más complejo, yo creo que eso es parte de lo que se dio en Venezuela, es que el rol de los civiles se les dé a los militares. Y Venezuela en eso, yo es que estoy convencida que es un régimen militar, es una dictadura militar. Creo que hay pocas las figuras, digamos, de Maduro y su entorno, pero el país está controlado por militares. Así es que ha podido pues tener ese apoyo de las fuerzas militares, y yo creo que es urgente en un futuro, en la democratización de Venezuela, que las Fuerzas Armadas venezolanas vuelvan a su rol esencial. ¿Qué veo yo hoy? Y pues es mucho de lo que tiene este documento. Un régimen que de alguna manera se estabilizó por sus remesas, 5 millones de venezolanos afuera, y yo todavía creo que pueden llegar a haber más, donde envían recursos a sus países, a sus familias, pues a su país, a sus familias, de sus regiones, con un precio del petróleo que también ha mejorado y que de alguna manera pues eso los ayuda, con una situación de América Latina muy compleja que no había hace unos años. Tenemos países en América Latina que estamos todos muy enredados. Estamos enredados en Perú, en Chile, en Colombia, en Brasil, y esto ha hecho pues que el foco en Venezuela se pierda. Entonces, me parece que también para el régimen ha sido como el encontrar un poco llamémoslo, de tranquilidad, y que no la región no está pues enfocada en eso. Y ha consolidado también su poder por la pandemia, porque pudo también recobrar mucho de ese poder regional que había perdido, y yo diría que lo que quiso para poder sostenerse en el poder en un principio fue repartir ese poder, y repartir ese poder en militares, en personas cercanas al régimen, y bueno, y también el descontrol que hay con grupos ilegales, de contrabando en la frontera con Colombia, en la frontera con Brasil. Lo otro que veo, obviamente, es una oposición que se ha debilitado, un Guaidó debilitado y ya casi pues que no cuenta. Y con una sociedad venezolana que es muy incrédula de que realmente se logre algo. Entonces, ahí es donde le toca a la oposición volver a ser creíble, volver a realmente unirse, reorganizarse, para que la gente esté convencida de que sí se va a poder haber una democratización en Venezuela. Eh, y sin lugar a dudas, pues no puede ser una oposición que llegue fracturada a un diálogo. Yo diría que hay unos elementos que Michael pone en su informe que me parecen muy interesantes. Uno es la justicia transicional. Yo creo que ese es un camino que si bien en Colombia ha sido lo más difícil dentro del proceso de paz, es lo más único y realmente lo que hace que se reconstruya y se pase la página. Si no, será muy difícil. Seguramente no es algo que haya que plantear ya en este momento. Una vez, esperemos, se reanuden. Yo ayer, cuando vi que el canciller hablaba de un posible diálogo con la oposición, pues quedé de alguna manera optimista de que se pueda reanudar ese diálogo. Yo creo que si no se plantea inmediatamente una justicia transicional, sí creo que tiene que ser una solución para que haya salidas. Si no se plantean salidas, al régimen y a los militares que han participado pues, en esta corrupción. Es muy difícil que se pueda pasar la página. Y otro de los puntos que decía Michael, que también me parece que se pueden haber elementos también del proceso de paz en Colombia, es con lo que tiene que ver con la implementación. De esa posición del gobierno de que no quisiera compartir esa implementación. Nosotros tenemos aquí en el proceso de paz de Colombia algo que fue único, que se hizo, que fue una implementación, una verificación tripartita, en donde estaban las partes y Naciones Unidas. Yo creo que Venezuela va por ese camino. Todo lo que se apoye, digamos, o lo que se resuelva en un acuerdo, debe haber un tercero de la comunidad internacional, ojalá sea Naciones Unidas, para poder avanzar de alguna manera. Lo otro que yo creo, sin lugar a dudas, es que lo que ha pasado con los grupos armados ilegales en la frontera, es un poco una frontera que pasa cualquier cosa, está sin ningún tipo de control, no hay ningún tipo de diálogo entre fuerzas militares en la región, ni entre políticos, llamémoslos a gobernadores en las regiones. Se rompió esa relación desde el año 2019 y no hay absolutamente ningún contacto entre los dos países, lo que ha hecho que eso se vuelva un territorio de nadie. Y esto al final del día yo creo que a Maduro le debe pesar, digamos, se lo cobran más adelante la gente de las fronteras, porque uno dice, bueno, ¿por qué el régimen hoy quisiera por qué quisiera negociar? Si prácticamente se ha ido volviendo como un statu quo en donde, salvo las sanciones y el quedarse en el poder con una mayor gobernabilidad, esas diría yo que son como los dos puntos en los que al gobierno venezolano le interesa, es quedarse con una mayor gobernabilidad, y ahí es que retomo el tema de los grupos al margen de la ley. La situación de Venezuela, de violencia, de inseguridad, hace que haya mucho rechazo de las regiones, de esas regiones y de esa población que vive en esa región contra el mismo régimen. Yo sí creo que ahí buscaría de alguna manera y encontrar cómo retomar la seguridad en esa frontera, le haría de alguna manera tener un mayor apoyo en un futuro. Porque aquí lo que uno dice es, estamos frente a una situación muy distinta a la de hace 3 años, en donde la posibilidad de que Maduro quiera una negociación o el régimen quiera una negociación es muy poca frente a lo que había hace 3 años, y es como la única salida que uno le ve hoy en día a la oposición. Entonces hay que ver, además de las sanciones, que creo que es exactamente el elemento clave para poder avanzar en una negociación. Ojalá se haga en México. Yo creo que Maduro busca un reconocimiento internacional. Eso fue lo que pasó, yo digo, desafortunadamente, en México, en la CELAC, hace un mes o 2 meses, donde otra vez volvió a la escena internacional, que es lo que en realidad siempre también le ha importado al régimen, y es como una busca de reconocimiento. Yo creo que el documento realmente es extraordinario, Michael. Muchas felicitaciones, porque uno lograr poner en tan corto, absolutamente casi todo lo que se ve el panorama de Venezuela y cómo mirar hacia adelante, de cómo se puede cambiar ese régimen, ha sido muy bueno. Muchas gracias. Estos serían mis comentarios.
Muchísimas gracias, ministra Holguín. Pasamos la palabra al presidente Lago. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos desde Santiago.
En primer lugar, quiero seguir hablando en español. Y quiero señalar también mi alegría de poder participar en este encuentro, porque creo que el documento es muy importante. El documento es un game changer. Está cambiando cómo vamos a mirar a futuro el tema. Pero es un documento también que obliga a un pensamiento de muy largo plazo. Porque implementar esto, como muy bien se dice aquí, es una tarea para los próximos 2 años, 3 años, 4 años, probablemente. Y por lo tanto, el elemento tiempo es muy importante. ¿Cómo se hace para ganar confianza si el tiempo es fundamental? En otras palabras, hay una crisis humanitaria en este momento producto del COVID. Cuando se empiece el proceso de conversaciones y negociaciones, ¿puede haber una respuesta inmediata en este tema? De manera que las negociaciones ganen el apoyo de la opinión pública, porque ver que el inicio de las negociaciones, algo muy pequeño, mejoró, por lo menos respecto al COVID y las vacunas y todo aquello. Entonces, primero, es una negociación a largo plazo. Segundo, es una negociación donde hay factores externos que no aparecen en este documento, pero que tenemos que considerar. Primero, lo que era antes el patio trasero de Estados Unidos, América Latina, ha dejado de serlo. Hoy día hay actores internacionales en América Latina muy importantes, tanto porque Putin tiene considerado que ahora él ya está dentro de América Latina a través de Venezuela y de Cuba, en cierto sentido. Y dos, muy importante creo también, la situación de China, porque China ha devenido en un actor importante económicamente hablando en América Latina de trascendencia. Y por lo tanto, a diferencia de antes, cualquier acuerdo sobre Venezuela, estos dos países van a jugar un rol desde sus roles dentro del Consejo de Seguridad de Naciones Unidas. No sería primera o segunda vez que este tema de Venezuela llega al Consejo de Seguridad y ahí entonces de repente aparece lo que antes jamás habría aparecido, la voz de Rusia y la voz de China. El tercer punto que me parece muy importante es cómo somos capaces también de hacer partícipes en esta negociación no solo a los partidos políticos que conocemos de oposición, el tema de los stakeholders, el tema de cómo la sociedad civil la incorporamos en esta negociación. Creo que es todo un debate, pero una vez que usted los incorpora, esos van a ser actores que van a influir. Entonces, ¿por qué digo esto? Porque es muy fácil incorporar, pero querrá decir entonces que esa incorporación nos va a acompañar por todo el resto de la negociación. Ya es difícil una negociación gobierno-oposición, entendiendo que la oposición son los partidos políticos que se oponen al régimen de Maduro, como ayer se oponían al régimen de Chávez. Pero ahora acá tenemos entonces los stakeholders, como ustedes dicen muy bien, de la sociedad civil. Y eso es lo que le va a dar legitimidad a las negociaciones. El otro punto que me gustaría que se considere en este tema tiene que ver con lo que acaba de mencionar María Ángeles respecto al tema del COVID. El COVID es el elemento que puede darle legitimidad a esta larga negociación que se ofrece por delante. Yo diría que el punto número uno a resolver, fuera de todos los temas iniciales que están en sentarse a la mesa, es dar una respuesta humanitaria frente al COVID. Esa parte, como dije antes, ganar tiempo es fundamental. El otro elemento que me parece que hay que colocar acá es entender el rol de los militares. Y aquí entonces, todo lo que sabemos y que lo que acaba de referir María, me lo ahorra, es lo que se ha avanzado en materia de justicia transicional. Todo el largo debate que tuvo el proceso de la paz en Colombia, que me tocó por distintas razones seguir un poco de cerca, en materia de justicia transicional es un elemento que tiene que estar aquí en la mesa. Y eso, básicamente, tener también claridad de cómo se va a establecer un mecanismo, en lo posible casi directo, con el mundo de las Fuerzas Armadas venezolanas. ¿Es posible tener algún canal auxiliar? ¿Es posible tener algún mecanismo adicional? Yo entiendo la relación de las Fuerzas Armadas con el gobierno ayer de Chávez, hoy de Maduro, y entiendo el rol fundamental que ellos juegan. pero también entiendo que en algún momento hay que tener un realismo de decir, con ellos tenemos que negociar definitivamente. Y por lo tanto, ¿cómo se hace esta negociación sin que se sientan ofendidos los que son las autoridades políticas actuales de Venezuela? Es un tema delicado, pero que hay que considerar. El último punto que quiero tocar, me podría explayar más sobre el documento mismo, pero por razones de tiempo no puedo. El último punto es Cuba. Cuba juega un rol muy importante, porque Cuba no solamente ha provisto, ayer en la época dorada del petróleo era muy importante, y ahora también sigue siendo importante, pero el efecto de Cuba sobre Venezuela creo que puede cambiar drásticamente si hay un mejoramiento de las relaciones entre la administración de Estados Unidos con Cuba. Es distinta la relación que había del presidente Obama para tener relaciones diplomáticas con Cuba. Yo entiendo el problema político que significa Miami, Florida y todo lo de la política interna de Estados Unidos vinculado al régimen cubano. Pero junto con eso hay también una posibilidad de apertura. Si Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, decide permitir que los americanos vayan de turismo a Cuba, hay una mejora automática entre Estados Unidos, con los costos que ello implica, y Cuba. Y a su vez, el régimen venezolano ayuda mucho a Cuba, pero depende mucho de Cuba, tanto del punto de vista de las influencias y los conocimientos que tienen en materia de servicios estratégicos de inteligencia. Y aquí entonces creo que hay un elemento que hay que considerar en esta negociación: cómo somos capaces de tener alguna línea directa con el régimen cubano y hacerles ver entonces lo importante que es resolver este tema, el de Venezuela en América Latina, porque ese también mejora la forma como Cuba se empieza a relacionar de una manera normal con América Latina. Acá hay muchos factores que interactúan unos con otros, pero la respuesta que ha dado Biden, por ejemplo, en el caso reciente de las elecciones en Nicaragua, es un indicador importante, porque la forma como se cruza a un régimen dictatorial como el de Daniel Ortega es muy fuerte, y por lo tanto algo tiene también que vincularse. ¿Qué va a significar esto a futuro? Y ahí entonces creo que las posibilidades de utilizar a Cuba como una forma de poder trabajar mejor con el régimen venezolano pasa a ser un elemento importante a considerar. Finalmente, me gustaría decir las posibilidades de ver cómo esto se implementa hacia adelante, porque lo que está planteado acá es una negociación larga, y una negociación larga puede hacer que la gente se sienta entonces insatisfecha, y cómo se ven resultados de inicio. Es todo un debate que debiera cumplirse en las primeras veces que se produzcan las conversaciones entre oposición y régimen venezolano al comienzo. Lo dejaría hasta ahí y me pido excusas porque desgraciadamente tengo que retirarme, y espero escuchar lo que tiene que decir Frankie Fukuyama, que siempre aprendemos mucho cada vez que él habla. Y me he sentido muy honrado de estar con todos ustedes, y de nuevo felicitaciones, Cintia, por esta iniciativa y por el documento tan importante que creo que es un cambio en la forma de mirar, y ojalá podamos seguir los análisis que aquí se hacen para poder avanzar mejor. Muchas gracias y felicitaciones por esta iniciativa. Adiós.
Presidente Lagos, muchísimas gracias por su comentario. We'll now turn to Professor Fukuyama, who will go back to English if you need to switch translation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Cindy, and thanks to the Latin American program for inviting me on this panel. I'm not quite sure why you did that because I'm no expert on Venezuela, but I must say I have a lot of Venezuelan friends and students, and I've in that way been very much immersed in that issue. I read the report and basically I agree with almost everything in it. I am a political realist, by which I mean to say that if you run up against a brick wall and you keep beating your head against the wall and nothing happens, you should probably back up and try to figure out if there's another way around the wall. And I think we've reached that point in terms of strategy towards Venezuela. And so you might as well try an extended negotiation. The only idea that I've heard from some Venezuelans is a really bad one, which is to turn to violence. This is the specialty of the regime. The regime is really good at violence. And I think that if that happens, it's going to be a disaster for them and for the country as a whole. Unfortunately, that's happening in other places that have seen military coups like Myanmar, and I don't think that that's a promising development. What I thought I could do is talk a little bit about regime stability in this kind of authoritarian regime. As Michael indicated, we don't have the old kind of authoritarian stability that we used to. Back when I was a graduate student, there were all these theories about totalitarian versus authoritarian government and lots of criteria for how you move from one to the other. And I think that those categories are largely irrelevant right now for a number of reasons. For example, there was a theory about the circular flow of power where power resided at the top of the system, it spread downwards, but then because of that control, you could change the way that people thought. There was a classic definition of totalitarian government that involved a police state, a single party, a dominant ideology, and the like. And that doesn't really apply, although I would say the one thing that is different about Venezuela is that it doesn't really have a clear ideology. I know that there's 21st century socialism and that a lot of people in Venezuela seem to believe that that's something. But the gap between, the ideals of whatever that vision for a future Venezuela is in reality, it's at this point seems so stark that it's hard to believe that anyone believes in it. Very much like, the fact that nobody believed in Marxism-Leninism by the end of the former Soviet Union. I would say that there are probably several things that contribute to authoritarian stability. So this regime, first of all, accepts a degree of, they don't contest the idea that democracy and elections are important. In fact, they claim that they want to follow constitutional procedures in their holding of elections. And so they recognize that that does provide them with a certain amount of cover, especially in international circles. I would say the other thing that is really important is that they don't bottle their citizens up. And in fact, they've created I believe that the number of Venezuelan refugees that have left the country now exceeds that of Syria, which was the largest migratory flow previously, more than 4 million people. Now, I have a lot of friends that were part of that out-migration, and I certainly sympathize and I'm glad that they got out. But unlike, former dictatorships, it means that the regime has got a kind of pressure valve where discontented people, just move to Colombia or Brazil or Peru or Ecuador and don't cause any trouble at home. And that creates a very, it destabilizes everybody else, but it leaves Venezuela better off. I think the single most important thing that's different about our world than any prior theory. By the way, I should just say political scientists are not good at this kind of theorizing. There are many theories that we used to believe in that are just not, they're just not right, and they've been contradicted by recent events. But I think that in this particular case, there's one factor that is really dominant, which Michael mentioned, which is the international dimension has gotten much, much more powerful. So why should there be a direct flight from Caracas to Istanbul? I mean, it's weird, right? And I think that from Turkey's standpoint, they're a classic realpolitik player. They don't have the interest of China and Russia in simply opposing everything the United States does, but they see an opening there and they want to walk through that open door. And then there are the big powers, Russia and China, that have not met American opposition to their activities in Venezuela. And so, they might as well keep doing that. I think that, as President Lagos said, Cuba remains an extremely important player in Venezuela. All of the Venezuelan security forces have been trained by their Cuban counterparts, and they're embedded in that security architecture. And the other aspect is the international economy, where for a while it was good and then it got really bad and now it's getting good again, which has been destabilizing for the regime. But it does mean that there is an importance that they attach to staying connected with these global sources of wealth. So what does it mean that you've got an authoritarian regime that's based on a coalition between the military, intelligence service, and the ruling party? I would, without really having a kind of dominant ideology that people are, that millions of young people are willing to sacrifice themselves for, and where the regime has kind of evolved into a band of robbers, where one of the biggest incentives holding them to the status quo is the fact that they're getting rich off of it. That kind of loyalty, I would think in the long run, is weaker than something that's purely based on ideology. I mean, ideology is no guarantee that the regime will stay intact, but it gets you through low points. And I think that a regime based on a simple material self-interest is going to have weak points in the future. We hope that these would have showed up, 3 years ago, but they didn't. But that doesn't mean that this system is going to persist forever. So I think that it's true that a negotiation will be stressful. It will lead to accusations of selling out democratic ideals. But it does seem to me that there's some basis for certain divisions appearing in the Venezuelan regime side. But as other people have emphasized, it's absolutely dependent on the unity of the opposition. And that's not been something we have been able to take for granted in the past. I would say that there was recently a meeting in Eastern Europe where a number of elections have been won by liberal parties. The most recent one was where I was over the last week in Prague, where this longtime oligarch, Andrej Babiš, was just voted out of office. And the one thing everybody says there is that it's really the unity of the opposition. Excuse me. It's really the unity of the opposition that's made the difference in all these cases. And that's something that's fully under the control of the opposition itself. And it's something that they really need to look to. So with that, I'll finish. And again, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Professor Fukuyama. I had a number of questions for the panelists. Perhaps since I know that Professor Fukuyama has to leave early, I might put out the question that I had for him, which is, thinking globally as you do, can you think of examples of similarly difficult transitions and some kind of positive?
Sorry, you cut out at the end. You were saying some kind of positive, I assume, outcome.
Oops, I think I'm frozen. Am I frozen?
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Okay. Were you able to hear the question, Frank?
I believe I got, yeah, I believe I got the essence of it. You want to know whether I can think of similar cases. Well, not really, but that just has to do with the fact that the Venezuelan case is, sui generis in so many respects, and I wouldn't take the absence of clear precedents for, a regime transition there, or the lack of good precedents as necessarily determinative. We've certainly seen surprising shifts of opinion, but I would say one thing is that the global climate has really changed, and it's very depressing. I mean, we've had, coups in Myanmar, in Sudan, a war in Ethiopia. So far this year, Nicaragua is descending into outright authoritarianism. And the United States, for 4 of the last 5 years has basically checked out of any support for global democracy. And that has, and plus which the nature of American democracy has not been very edifying, to say the least, in recent years. And so I think the role of the US as a beacon of freedom has been very much diminished. And I, take seriously these global norms about democracy. When somebody's contemplating launching a coup and they're trying to figure out how much international support they're going to get, I think that, a lot of them have calculated that neither the US nor Europe, for that matter, is really all that is not going to be terribly helpful.
Okay, well, we can always hope that the Summit for Democracy taking place in December might restore some form of emphasis on these international democratic norms. I'm going to take a question that's come from Bill Chavez, formerly of the US Department of Defense, Inter-American Dialogue now as a fellow. It's a question for Michael about specific recommendations on the kind of signaling forces from both the opposition and the international community. What kinds of signals can you think of with respect to creating the right incentives? And that obviously spills over into other questions that we've had about transitional justice. So Michael, that's a question for you. We're running out of time, so concise, please. Thank you. Michael, you're on mute. Mute, thanks.
Yes, thanks for the question, Cindy. I think the international community has been sort of changing the kind of signals that they've been sending to the regime and to the opposition. On the one hand, the US and Europe are working more on a multilateral framework to deal with Venezuela. although I think there's still deep divisions between them on how to proceed, particularly on the electoral front. And I think also that more needs to be done. And, you know, currently Venezuela is as sanctioned as Iran, particularly with secondary sanctions, and it's more isolated diplomatically than Cuba, okay? We don't have a consulate, a US consulate in Venezuela. We don't have an embassy in Venezuela. That's right now functioning in Bogota. And so many people think, you know, what kind of signals that could encourage the kind of talks that we're talking about that leads to a political opening, that leads later on to a stronger opposition and to a full democratization. I think it's going to require a more involvement by the US. So far, the US has basically putting Venezuela in a back burner, although it supports the talks. And I think that they have to signal very clearly three things. First, how are they going to lift sanctions? What's the phasing of those sanctions that they're expecting? The broad claim is it's only free and fair elections. Okay, but in what stage, how it's going to happen? Secondly, I think they have other tools that the US has not been using. For example, diplomatic tools. Can you open again direct flights? I mean, Professor Fukuyama was saying, you know, the direct flight there is from Caracas to Istanbul. Well, there's no direct flight from Caracas to Miami. You know, and in La Habana, there are plenty of direct flights between La Habana and Miami. Do you signal on that side? Do you signal with US, you know, US consulate, not recognition, political recognition? You're going to open the embassy in Caracas, but are you willing to open the consulate for traveling purposes, for example? So I think, you know, the US has many tools beyond sanctions that might help incentive the regime to open the political system more quickly. But so far, I think they've been waiting for a quid pro quo kind of situation, which obviously the regime is not going to play. And the US also doesn't want to give up first because they think that's going to make them look weak, particularly given the midterm elections in the US. So we're trapped on those bases. And I think here we need to think out of the box, because it's important, because otherwise the opposition doesn't have much to give up right now, because it's in a very weak position.
Michael, thank you. Or María Ángela, con su permiso, le voy a poner en inglés. You were an important member, promoter of the Lima Commission, which has currently collapsed. What role, if any, do you countries of the region being able to take encourage this process forward?
Pues, Cintia, cuando se creó el Grupo de Lima, que lo creamos básicamente México, Perú y Colombia, que fuimos como los primeros que dijimos en ningún foro, ningún mecanismo regional podemos hablar de Venezuela porque es imposible, porque en la OEA no hay los votos, en CELAC el Caribe tampoco deja, en UNASUR, etcétera. Era sobre todo el tema humanitario. Estábamos empezando a enfrentar un tema que iba a ser, pues que nunca en realidad nos imaginamos que iba a llegar a los niveles que ha llegado, casi 5 millones o más de venezolanos afuera, como está el número igual a Siria, pero era para ponernos un poco de acuerdo en cómo podían ser las políticas migratorias y cómo íbamos a recibir a los venezolanos. Después, pero siempre en ese momento sobre la base de que la salida para Venezuela era una salida de diálogo y de negociación. No éramos en ese momento países que estuviéramos pensando en que la única salida tenía que ser inmediata y que hubiera un cerco diplomático para más o menos cerrarle cualquier posibilidad al régimen. Ya empiezan a haber cambios en los gobiernos y ya empieza esa política que yo personalmente creo que fue muy equivocada, en el caso de Colombia muy equivocada. Nosotros tenemos Todo lo que pasa en Venezuela repercute en Colombia de todas maneras y la situación que hay de descontrol es absoluto, que eso acaba también llegando a Colombia y porque además creemos que la cantidad de colombianos que viven en Venezuela, millones de colombianos que durante décadas se fueron, están completamente sin ni una oficina consular, ni absolutamente un funcionario que los pueda apoyar y ayudar. Entonces el Grupo de Lima fue como perdiendo digamos, su norte. Hoy en día pues no existe. Y yo creo que la situación, y vuelvo y lo repito lo que había dicho, la situación de América Latina está muy difícil en muchos países y esto hace que Venezuela ya no sea como el único foco. Yo creo, y ojalá sea así, que el cambio en las elecciones que se avecinan en varios países, volvamos a pensar la importancia de apoyar a Venezuela en una redemocratización, pero sabiendo que es una salida negociada, que es una salida que toma tiempo, pero que es así lo que yo creo que Venezuela necesita de apoyo en la comunidad, de la parte de la comunidad internacional. Creo que lo que planteaba el presidente Lagos de Cuba, nosotros intentamos muchas veces que los cubanos hicieran parte, muchas veces les hablamos pues fue imposible. Yo eso lo veo, no lo veo como una posibilidad, yo los veo a ellos completamente que no van a entrar a ser parte de ningún tipo de cambio. Y creo que lo que ha pasado con Rusia es que trasladaron un poco la Guerra Fría a este lado. Ojalá, ahí Rusia está en México, pero yo veo que puede haber un rol para una América Latina, pero una América Latina que piense que la salida es una salida negociada, no una salida distinta, ni que apoya esa posición radical que busca salidas extraordinarias y que llevamos pues 20 años y seguimos sin encontrarlas.
Thanks very much. And since we're just about out of time, a final question for Michael that is not so, but is obviously on the minds of many of us who are watching what's happening. There are upcoming elections later this month for governors and mayors. Can you tell us something about the level of international, also the opposition's participation and desire to participate in those elections?
Well, this is an important election, but with very little stakes in place for the regime, right? So, and prior to the elections, we saw, an agreement that came out of a negotiation with certain parts of the opposition that allowed to change 2 of the 3 directors of the CNE, which has in turn allowed to audit the electoral registry. And it has also allowed to gain some credibility or not, but not all the credibility in the electoral system. The software has been audited. So the idea that votes are not going to be counted seems to be right now something that both directors that are close to the opposition believe that's not going to be the case. Nonetheless, the political election, from a political point of view, the election is still problematic in the sense that it's skewed. The parties, the leaders of the party don't control their own label, which has created internal divisions of many sorts within the opposition. And also the idea of running or not participating, boycotting or participating in the election has also been a contentious issue within the opposition, particularly with those who still believe that not only we should not participate, but we should continue to recognize the interim government for the years to come. And that's created a very fragmented opposition, one that has very few resources to compete in terms of having resources to mobilize society, to mobilize voters. And with a more loyal opposition that is running parallel to the G4, what we call the G4, that is funded and that has been able to mobilize some of the voters, particularly in large states like Táchira and Miranda. And this is creating a very difficult situation for the opposition. And so my expectation is that, you know, the EU is going to participate. I think the report that is going to come out of the mission is going to be critical. I don't think it's going to legitimize the election, but it's going to acknowledge some of the advancements in terms of the audits that have been conducted, which I think can help, you know, negotiating sort of the full electoral schedule in Mexico City if talks are resumed. Finally, in terms of outcomes, my view is that the election is going to have a deep impact, both in the talks and in the internal dynamics of the opposition. But because at the end, the opposition, if they want to rebuild its strength domestically, it needs to really understand that the talks are going to allow for some political opening. I believe that. But without reuniting, the regime can open up and still win elections if they're not united. And so this idea that the talks are just a straight path towards a democratic transition, I think is unrealistic. You need the political opening, you need to reunite, and then you need to build a broader social coalition that connects with people and with their problem. And that will allow to mobilize society. And with that, I think we have a greater chance of a democratization in Venezuela. That's the long route that I see ahead. And the long negotiations that both Professor Fukuyama and President Lagos and Maria Angela were mentioning.
Michael, thanks so much. Thanks for your work. Thank you, Canciller Holguín, for your participation. Thanks also to President Lagos and Professor Fukuyama, early but still left us with a great deal of insight and wisdom from their vast experience. Thank you to all who joined this webinar for your good questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time of them, but we welcome your comments por escrito on the report that's on our website. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Cynthia.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Maria Angela and Professor Fukuyama.
Gracias, Michael.